Hi Booktube, Aaron here. Hope you're doing very well. Today I'm going to be wrapping up everything that I read in the month of August, and then I'll go through what I'm reading at the moment and then go through some plans I have for September. There are a lot of events in September, and so I've got some rather loose plans. So there are a few things that are set in stone, but some other loose plans that I've got more possibilities rather than books I'm saying I'm going to read for each event. But first off, we'll go into what I read in August. I finished 9 books, which is, at least as far as I think of it, still quite a lot of books to read in 1 month. Some of them I've been working on over some time, some of them are quite short, and some of them are books that you get a bit obsessive with, and they sort of work in a way, reading them at a slightly quicker pace. So I'll go through the first 3 books, which I made in a video, a random reading update video. Feels like about like over a month that I made that video. Looking back at these books, it feels like quite some time since I've read them. But I'll go through them quickly. There's The Leopard by Giuseppe de Lampedusa, about a Sicilian family during the 19th century. There's a lot of social change going on, and it's just really just marvelously written. But there's a lot of tension socially and within the family. A few sort of weird family secrets in there. But yeah, really, it's just the quality and the beauty of the writing that really makes it stand out. And then there was Faulkner in August, an annual event where we read works by William Faulkner in the month of August, and I was sort of co-hosting. I suppose I was one of the participants, one of the people with the channel, and who read it, and yeah, haven't said too much, but I tried to go into As I Lay Dying, the book that we were reading this year, back in the update video I made. It was a bit of an odd, uncanny experience, I suppose, because there are things I noticed that I didn't notice the first time I read it. I read this about, I don't know, about 7 or 8 years ago. Well, maybe not quite that long ago, maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And yeah, it was odd noticing those things, but also there were resonances that I felt from the first time that weren't there the second time as well. And so there was more, but there was also less. And so it was, yeah, very odd coming back to it after a little bit of time. And then just the other one that I mentioned in that reading update was Paradise, the last part of Dante's Divine Comedy. So I've been, for nearly a year, I've been making my way through the Divine Comedy, and I've just been loving it, really. And the last time I had not much of an idea what was going on in Paradise, and this time I had a bit more of an idea, uh, which is always nice. So maybe it'll make even more sense the next time I read it. And then there are 6 more books to go through. 3 of them are part of a series, so I'll do them together. So the next 3 are a bit of a miscellany. We've got On the Nature of the Universe by Lucretius, a verse translation by Ronald Melville. I started reading this while I was also reading Paradise and realised they're maybe not the best books to be reading together at the same time. It's a bit of an odd one. It's a poem describing how the world works. It's also a kind of explanation of Epicurean philosophy, which is a philosophy about their. I mean, Lucretius mentions the gods, but they're kind of totally separate to the human world. The human world is just, what we see, really. We don't have to be afraid of the gods. We don't have to be afraid of the afterlife. He speaks of the human soul as being something that exists like anything else, but also, it dies like anything else. So, it say it's very different to the way lots of people were thinking at the time he was writing. He was, I think, writing during the Roman Republic. Does it say? Or maybe a little later on. Yes, the first century BC. So it's probably during the Roman Republic, and but also there's that element of not having to be afraid at the same time, and him explaining how the world works so that you know, and then you can just go on and enjoy it. It's interesting. There's the thing that everyone always brings up. It's on the back here as well about atomic theory, and he sort of explains how everything's made out of tiny particles, and in some ways it's similar to how we understand atomic theory, and in other ways it's very different. And that was one of the things that, you know, it's not really something I can judge the book for, but it's one of the things that makes it a bit difficult as a modern reader to read this, which is when he's going into certain theories about how things work. For example, what makes something flammable. For him, the atoms that make up that material have a seed of flame in them, and you just need the right reaction to, you know, for that seed to grow and for fire to happen, which, you know, is maybe quite a poetic way of thinking of it, and yet, you know, we know that it's very different. Another one of the troubles, I suppose, was that this is also poetry at the same time, and yet the poetry itself, at least the way it was rendered in the translation, was a bit clunky, a bit dull, felt very wooden, and so it was really the ideas and the worldview that I was meeting here on the page that, you know, that was really the engaging thing when it came to this work. There were a few things I quite liked when he's explaining. It's very observational, I suppose, which is in keeping with his worldview, and it's like noticing how sound and light move at different speeds, and there's just a description of somebody chopping wood at a distance, and how you sort of see them first and then the sound follows. And, you know, it's very simple. It's, you know, something that also we see every day, and yet there was a bit of, I don't know, a kind of satisfaction there that there was that continuity, particularly when there are some sort of weirder bits at other parts. The bit I really loved was the very, very end, which is a bit of a shame. It's just when it got going. He's talking about disease and ailments, and he takes Thucydides as a source and is writing about the plague at Athens, and it's pretty metal. Just want to see if I could read any of it. It's a bit gruesome, but I like finally suddenly it felt alive to me. So he says, if a man chanced to escape the ruin of death, yet later from foul ulcers and black flux from the bowels, a lingering death awaited him, or else a copious stream of putrid blood with violent headache followed out through the nostrils, and all his body's strength flowed into it. And if a man, surviving this savage flux of noisome blood, yet into his limbs and sinews, and even the genital parts the plague went on, some in their grievous fear of death's dark gates severed their manly parts to save their lives. Sorry, just being childish. And some without their hands or feet, yet still clung on to their life, and others lost their eyes, so strongly had the fear of death assailed them. And some oblivion of everything took hold of, that they knew not who they were. And it goes on, and although bodies piled on bodies lay in multitudes unburied, birds and beasts avoided them, warned by the piercing stench, or, having tasted, died a speedy death. In truth, in those dark days, scarce any bird was to be seen, nor from the forests came wild beasts in search of prey, for nearly all were sickening with the deadly plague and dying. It just goes on, and it's terrible and disgusting and visceral. But I was loving it then. I was really enjoying it, and I turned the page and see there's only a page left, and it was quite sad. So anyway, Lucretius, a mixed bag. Someone to grapple with again, I'm sure, and maybe I'll try another translation in the future. But there's plenty of other stuff from the ancient world I'd like to try out before then. Next up, some more poetry. Don Paterson, The Arctic. Don't have too much to say about this collection. I read an earlier collection of his called Rain earlier on in the year. Really, really loved that. And I still very much liked this, but it didn't feel quite as strong to me, at least in terms of how the poem comes across and sort of the feeling of conviction in the poet. I'm not sure if that makes much sense. However, there were some really great poems in here. There's a poem here called Echoism after Ovid, about Echo and Narcissus, that sort of starts off as a prose poem and slowly sort of turns into verse at the end as the echo kind of dies away, maybe. There's an early poem in here that was really, really, really quite moving, called Snaba, Snaba, about his father's death. There are a couple of poems towards the beginning of the collection about his father's death, and it's just beautifully done. And a few other quite lovely poems. There's Spring Letter here, which is a sort of commentary on the times. It was written in March 2022. Sort of looking back at Brexit, if I remember correctly. There are a few Brexit poems in here. Not Brexit, sorry, at the pandemic and Boris Johnson and all that fun stuff. There's a dot poem that you need a magnifying glass to read. That's not just a dot, it does have words in it. I liked it, but not as didn't feel as strong or as I'm trying to think of the right word. There felt like there were more peaks and valleys in this collection, whereas Rain felt a bit more consistent. I suppose that's a way of putting it. And then I also read A Field Guide to Getting Lost by Rebecca Solnit, which was delightful. I really enjoyed it. Essays on the first essay is about mainly getting lost in the wilderness, on search and rescue, on I suppose our perception of space and place, which are questions I enjoy looking into. As you look at the table of contents, I'm not sure if you can make it out. The first essay here is called Open Door, and then the next is The Blue of Distance, then Daisy Chains, and then The Blue of Distance, and it goes on and on like that. There's a sort of a named one, and then a continuation of a theme of The Blue of Distance, which all of them work independently as their own essays. It's not necessarily one extended essay. And I actually preferred it. I actually preferred those essays called The Blue of Distance. They quite often took a theme from history or from art and just ran with it, tried to find connections. Sometimes an element of her own life would come in as well. And then, it was just more intriguing, and it felt a little more intellectually vital, I suppose. Whereas the ones with their own titles, such as Daisy Chain or what else was there? Two Arrowheads is another one. Or there's one about called Abandon, which was about making a film in an abandoned hospital, I think. And she was very punky and quite young at the time, and it was about one of her other punky friends and how they grew up. And so it was very, those were much more reflective, and they tended to still link in to the major theme of the book. But the Blue of Distance ones just sort of seemed to open out, and so I enjoyed that. Just this feeling of a mind going out to all kinds of places. Some really interesting essays in here. I'd recommend it now. It's something I'd love to revisit. Um, it's quite interesting, that essay, Abandon, about the friend and the abandoned hospital, was probably my least favourite essay in there, and yet it's the one that stands out the most, and it's intriguing why that's the case. Maybe I'll reread it and actually enjoy it more. I don't know. And then the next three books are part of a series. I've been making my way through Karl Ove Knausgård's My Struggle books. It's a series of 6 books where he writes about his own life. He writes about his father's death and the fallout from that, about his family life, how that sort of contrasts with his own childhood, and his own ambitions to be a writer and to write something good and lasting, and how his own personal life and his eventual family life, how they are almost in content, there's kind of contest there for attention and energy. And also partway through as well, he has this, he doesn't particularly like the person he is all the time, and he's just honestly trying to do the best to be a good person, and that's his aim as well. So, a rough summary of what it is. That's what it is. But also, with where I am, I'm in the last book now. It's also about having written the book as well, and so the book starts talking about the book, and I find that really intriguing. I've been enjoying that. But anyway, I'd read book 2 last month in July, which was different from the first book, but very much carries on in the same vein at the same time. And it sort of thematically, at the very end, it opens its way into the next book, which is a reflection on his childhood. I will go through all of the books and give a summary and more of my thoughts about it once I've finished the whole thing in an update video. But book number 3 is Boyhood Island, as you can guess, about his boyhood, and very conveniently he grew up on an island, and so the time is also its own kind of island. It begins with him as essentially a baby with his parents when they moved to the island, and then ends with him just about sort of hitting puberty, about to go up into another school, and they're moving off the island to another town, and yeah, it's just about his day-to-day life as a kid, the figure of his father, his fear of his father, and I feel like he's very much, he's not always necessarily telling the story from a child's perspective. It's very much a feeling of being an adult and remembering how you saw things as a child, if you can kind of see that distinction. But the way he does that, then it kind of helps you feel nostalgic, um, even though it's very different. Your circumstances might be different. You might not have grown up on an island in Norway, and yet the way he's talking about it, the things that he gives attention to, and he gives resonance. Um, you can kind of relate that to your own episodes at the same time, and so the sense of nostalgia comes across. So I enjoyed it, but where the first couple of books there's a lot of jumping back and forwards, this is all sort of forward momentum. Him growing up, and it kind of goes like that more or less through the next 2 books. That the books might not be told chronologically per se, but this book he's a kid, the next one he's an adolescent essentially, or he's just finished high school in Dancing in the Dark, and then the next book carries on from that. This is about him going up to northern Norway to be a teacher after he's finished high school, and he's just trying to earn money to become a writer, and he makes some serious blunders, and it's intriguing. But I was feeling definitely by that book it's kind of losing momentum a bit, just because we've been sort of relying so much on what we could call the adult voice of Knausgård and his digressions and his sort of linking to his life to other things. You don't get that quite as much, if at all, in these middle volumes. And then it goes into Some Rain Must Fall, which I preferred a little bit to those two there, about him moving to Bergen to go on a creative writing course, and then the 13 years that follow where he's still living in Bergen and still trying to make it as a writer, trying to make ends meet, getting into relationships, making mistakes, and sort of getting up to the point where he's making this mental effort to be a better person. What I really liked about book 5, Some Rain Must Fall, was that it links in, it sort of follows on from where the first book finished, and then it then keeps going and then provides the context for the second book. And so suddenly, having had his family life explained a little more, having had some of his adolescence and some of his flaws explored a little bit in these 3 books, then suddenly everything you'd read before them and what you're going to go on to read in the last book suddenly feel much more grounded. And so it is, I think it's still quite well done and really quite satisfying. But it is a lot of reading to do for that. I will say that it does warrant reading quite quickly, or not that you're speed reading it, but that you don't Google every reference that comes up or anything like that. You just sort of go with the flow, and just try to stay in the world of the book and reading them in quick succession. Even though I did try to read some of them with sort of gaps between, those gaps started getting shorter and shorter until there were no gaps at all. So that's how I've found it so far, and that will then segue into what I'm reading at the moment, which is the last book, The End, which is about him having written the first 2 books. The first book's about to be published, and all of the fallout that sort of happened from him writing the first book, and then he's sort of going on in a very essayistic way, sort of trying to explain what he's doing with language and the importance of certain names. And I'm sure it is making sense to me, but I'll be able to be able to talk about it a little clearer, I think, once I've finished it. Then I've also been very slowly making my way through the complete poems of Emily Dickinson, slowly but surely. I've said before that Dickinson is very much a poet who I don't know, sort of urges me on to daydream. And I don't mean that she's boring and that I just want to be thinking of anything else when reading her, but rather that when I've finished one of her poems, I then start thinking about the poem, and then suddenly I'm sort of somewhere else and thinking about all kinds of other things that maybe I wouldn't have been thinking about were it not for the poem. Even if it's just to do with certain images and certain settings she seems to be evoking in the poem, even that can sort of get me just thinking in areas I don't always do. And the same goes for the next poet I've been reading as well, John Ashberry. He's quite surreal, quite evasive, but quite charming in his own way, and quite satisfying as well. I've just found it delightful, and the poems are always quite surprising. You're never quite sure what's gonna. You read the title, and then you never really know what's going to happen. So I've been very much enjoying John Ashberry. This is his selected poems up until the mid-80s, and I'm I don't know, not even a quarter of the way through. So I'm going through both of those poets very slowly. So that might be all the poetry I read for a little while. And that's what I'm reading at the moment. Then a few things for September. So one thing is that I've got more or less set down is a buddy read with Alan from Big Hard Books and Classics, and we're going to be reading Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. I think it'll be a good book to do as a buddy read. I think. I don't know, for some reason these bigger, sort of more historical books, maybe quite character-based books, could be useful for a buddy read. And then we've got a few events in September, and I'm going to try and engage with these three that I'm bringing up. The first is Shaketember, which is run by Kelly from Books I'm Not Reading, Jason from Old Blues Chapter and Verse, and Nicole from A Day of Small Things. And there are a few Shakespeare plays they're going to be looking at this year, and I thought I'd make an effort to at least read one of them, which is Twelfth Night, or What You Will, which I can't remember that well. And as I was saying in a video a little earlier, I think, I can't remember, I'm beginning to doubt sometimes which Shakespeare plays I've read. There are some of the comedies that I am sort of confused with each other, so I'd quite like to do a systematic read through all of Shakespeare's plays and maybe straighten them all out a bit. But for now, I'll be reading Twelfth Night for Shaketember, all on my trusty Kindle, so that I don't get crushed to death by my collected Shakespeare. And then there's Shorty September, which is hosted by Burton Shan from Past Story Time, and Heather from Too Many Heathers, I think her channel name is now. And it's just to read short books. There are specific prompts which I probably should have written down, but I'm not going to be trying to fulfill all of the prompts. So I've just got a pile of short books that I wanted to read and I found from my bookcase, and I'll keep them as a pile of possibilities. And if it feels like there's a good gap in what I'm reading, or if I need a change of pace, I might try one of them. And quite a few of them are books that I've been meaning to get to for some time. And it's funny how sometimes, you think that the books that you're putting off, or that you just keep forgetting about, are the big books, the ones that feel like a commitment. Whereas often for me, or at least half of the time for me, it's these really short books, and I'm not sure why. So anyway, we've got To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf, and I'm sort of keen to get to know Virginia Woolf much better. We've got Death Threats and Other Stories by George Simenon. These are some Maigret mysteries. We've got The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, so a very short one there. We've got Invisible Cities by Italo Calvino. We've got The Man of 50 by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, which is, all of these are quite short. This is like 60 pages. And then maybe one of the longest of the bunch, but still very short, In the Heart of the Country by J.M. Coetzee, or again, not entirely sure on the pronunciation. I wonder which is the longest, if you'll humour me. So this one's 151 pages. This was like 63 pages. Invisible Cities is 148 pages, so about the same length as In the Heart of the Country. Yellow Wallpaper, again very short, I think, maybe only about 60 pages. The book itself is 59 pages long. Death Threats and Other Stories is 181. So far this is the longest. And To the Lighthouse is 154 pages, so not quite the longest of them, about average. So yeah, I'm not sure which of these I'll get to, but I will, maybe I'll just leave them as a pile just sitting around somewhere to remind me to just pick up a short book when I need a change of pace. And then the other event that I'd be quite excited to try and engage with is Framed in September, which is all about art. So you can read about art. You can also go to a gallery or an exhibition, and you can also make art as well. And that might be a good incentive for me to actually finish a painting I've been slowly working on for like 4 years, and all I've got. See if essentially I paint a little bit and then and then leave it, and so all I've got is like like a background, or not even a background, the beginnings of a background, and sort of change my mind about what to do with it. But maybe I'll do something with that, and actually do some painting, or maybe I'll sketch and doodle. I'm not sure, but I might share any Framed in September creations that I come up with. But then, I'd like to read something about art. I could read a biography or the letters of Vincent van Gogh, which I've had on my shelves for ages. But I thought I'd read one of these big art books, and I've got this. This is Impressionist Portraits by Melissa McQuillan. And it's about Impressionist portraits. And so McQuillan has written a pretty good, really quite a short introduction, considering, it's, not a lot of writing, there's still lots of pictures and things in there. And previous owners got sort of cuttings of some paintings from the period as well, which is quite nice. But then it's, lots of paintings. That's by Frederic Baziel. And it's got a little sort of description and discussion. But it's got Renoir and Degas and Monet and probably Manet, Edgar Degas. It's got Manet in there as well. Does it have any Pissarro or Pizarro? The Cézanne. Anyway, we'll see. Yeah, it's got some Pissarro. I'm not sure how to say his name. But I've always liked his work when I've seen it in galleries and things. And that's it. So that's for Framed in September. And then we'll see how the rest of the month goes. It's relatively loose, I suppose. I've got a brick of a book to finish. Then I'll be picking up another brick of a book. I was maybe going to read Tender as the Night by Fitzgerald, but I think I might put that off, even though I was planning to try and read it in the summertime. But I'm just, I don't know, not quite in the mood for Fitzgerald at the moment, and that might be a change in taste, I'm not sure. But it'd be interesting to revisit him, but just not quite in the mood for Fitzgerald at the moment. So I think I'll leave it at that for my plans at the moment. But anyway, ramble over. So thank you very much for watching. I hope there was at least something interesting in there for you. But for now, thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.